Good day once again. Today, we will be talking about disaster risk reduction and management framework, its policies, and the cycle. But before again proceeding, you can refer to the previous video link on the different classification of hazards and hazard profile of the Philippines. In the ASEAN region, we have the AHA Center. This is the ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance on Disaster Management, and it is based in Jakarta, Indonesia. What is disaster management? It is the effort to reduce or avoid losses caused by hazards, to ensure immediate assistance to victims of disaster, as well as to achieve swift recovery and return to normalcy after a disaster. It is a cyclical process starting from mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. Under mitigation, this is the effort to minimize potential impact of disaster. And what is mitigation? It is building up on codes, zoning, public campaign. I'm sure you all know the Philippines weather or public storm signal is part of a mitigation process. We shall discuss that in a while. Next, we have preparedness. Ano yung preparedness? Ito yung paghahanda. How do we respond to disaster when it strikes? We have trainings, we have exercises, contingency planning, warning and alert signals. Each barangays or each locality is to prepare their DRRM plans. Regularly or quarterly, we have national simulation earthquake drills for all schools and offices. That is part of preparedness. Next, we have response. Response happens after the disaster has occurred. Or it can also happen before. No? Activities that are carried out on the immediate aftermath of a disaster to minimize effects of disaster. Search and rescue. Rapid assessment para alam mo, we assess the damages, the loss of lives, and logistical distribution. Next, we have recovery. This is bringing back the community back to normal. Normalcy meaning before there was a disaster or even better. That's why we have now what we call as building back better. Muling pagbangon, recovery. So what is disaster risk reduction? We had a question in Module 2 which says, is hazard preventable? Is disaster preventable? The answer is both yes. Concept and practice of reducing disaster risk. We have systematic efforts. We analyze, we manage causal factors that might affect the disaster. Therefore, reducing the exposure to hazards and lessening the vulnerability. You should think of our hazard vulnerability mathematical equations on this. So we use wise management and improved preparedness. This definition comes from the UNSDR, United Nations Institute for Sustainable Disaster and Resilience. What is disaster risk management? This is more of a process using administrative directives, the whole organization, and operational skills. It implements strategies, policies, and improving coping capacities. Disaster risk management evolved or was started under risk management. It is the systematic approach and practice of managing uncertainty to minimize potential harm or loss. I'd like to give you a background that risk management was used in the banking industry. You look at the risk whether before giving a loan, you study whether that person or such a company can pay off its loan. Hindi mababawasan o hindi itatakbo or hindi malulugi yung company para mabayaran yung utang. And we all know, pag nalugi o hindi mabayaran yung utang, walang kikitain yung bangko, walang interest. It is through loans where banks earn. That's why in risk management for disaster, we minimize the potential harm and loss of humanity. So this definition of risk management, we can see in our main document for DRR in the Philippines. The most minimum is disaster response. When does disaster response happen? Immediately after a disaster. Yung iba within the next few hours, within the next 24 hours, kailangan may immediate response. Quick response. It can be during or immediately after a disaster. In order, first and foremost, to save lives, reduce health impact, and ensure public safety, thereby meeting the basic subsistence needs of people that were affected. So, ang disaster response is immediate and short-term in nature. Which has a bigger scope? Disaster response or disaster risk reduction? The correct answer is disaster risk reduction. When you talk about disaster risk reduction, you talk about or you think about the whole mathematical equation considering hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and capacity. We reduce the disaster risk. Again, what is disaster risk? It's reducing the loss and harm to the community. So, pag merong hazard, we think of how to prepare. Ano ba ang gagawin nating contingency plan pag bumagyo? Ano ang gagawin nating contingency plan pag magkabaha? Ano ang gagawin nating contingency plan pagkaroon ng earthquake? Meron ba tayong typhoon signal warning system? Meron ba tayong water level gauge doon sa mababang lugar sa atin? So, tinitignan mo, sino ang susundin natin ng natatawag o sinong sisigaw ng baha? Si kapitan ba? O yung mga taong malapit sa tabi ng ilog? So, tinitignan natin doon yung mga hazard. Again, what is hazard in Tagalog? Ito yung panganib. Yung sakuna, yun ang disaster. Ang hazard, yun ang panganib. Next, sabi natin yung exposure. Sino ba yung mga taong dapat natin evacuate? Yung mga bahay ba na malapit sa tabi ng ilog? Saan natin iladalhin sila? Doon ba malapit din sa ilog o dapat sa kabundukan? Sa relocation. Evacuation and relocation. I'd like to remind you, mamaya i-discuss natin, bawal nang gamitin ang mga public schools. So, lahat ng public schools bilang evacuation centers. Meron ng batas and we will be discussing that. Next, merong vulnerability and capacity. What is the vulnerability? Ano ba yung transfer risk? Meron bang insurance yung mga palayan? Meron ba tayong social protection? Meron ba tayong bibigay na ayuda? Tulong sa mga ating bibigyan na relocate. Yung matitigas na ulo, kailangan ba bigyan muna ng isang kabang bigas bago sumama sa relocation o sa evacuation? May ganong pangyayari ngayon. No? Reducing the vulnerability and enhancing the capacity. Uunahin ba natin i-evacuate lahat ng mga bata? Susunod na matatanda? At susunod yung mga nanay o magulang na magbubuntis. Capacities. Yung malalakas ba at yung mga matatapang sila ang mag-gather sa mga community. So that is part disaster risk and reduction. Yaang part ng disaster risk reduction happens at the community and bigger LGUs. So binabawasan ang disaster risk. We have a national framework. In the Philippines, it took almost 10 years for RA 10121, otherwise known as the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction Management Act of 2010. It was approved after Typhoon Ondoy and it took 10 years for it to be crafted. Kung hindi nagka-Ondoy, wala tayong DRRM Act. Next, we have RA 9729. Nauna pa yung Climate Change Act noong 2009. And magka-akibat yung dalawa na yan. As I mentioned also, kanina, schools, all public schools are not allowed to be used as evacuation centers. Yan yung Children's Emergency Relief and Protection Act, RA 10821, which was enacted in 2016, June 2016. And at present, we are also focusing on the 10-point agenda of the current administration wherein disaster preparedness is one of the priorities. All of those things, all of this framework or policies contributes to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. The Philippine DRRM Act responds to the Sendai Framework for DRR. The Climate Change Act responds to the Treaty of Paris. And as I mentioned, all of those contributes to the Sustainable Development Goals. Okay. What is the background of the Philippine Dream Act of 2010? It is a milestone in our history. As I told you, or mentioned, we were only governed by an executive order or a presidential decree prior to having DRRM Act. It states there from disaster relief and response approach to DRRM. Noong mga 1960s, marami sa inyo hindi pa buhay, up until the 1990 or even early 2000, relief. Ibig sabihin relief, pag bumagyo, magka-earthquake, the response is to give the immediate relief. Diba kanina, in Module 3, we discussed that. That's why, here's a joke. What is DSWD now? Department of Social Work and Development. It used to be DSSD. And during the disaster relief, DSSD was known as something else. Ano yung common relief noon? It was mostly canned goods. Sardinas. Swerte na kung meron kang spam or meatloaf. So DSSD was the Department of Sari-Saring Delata. Now it's Disaster Department of Social Work and Development. Response approach. We have child-friendly spaces. We have child protection tracking systems. We have women-friendly spaces. Comprehensive. Because of our DREAM Act 10121. Also, in RA 10121, we have the establishment of an organizational structure. May NDRMC ngayon, tapos may OCD, tapos may DOH, may DepEd, may DPWH. Lahat sila may kanya-kanyang roles na gagampanan. And they comprise the DRRM Council. Last feature is it thinks about multi-hazards, multi-sectoral, interagency, and community-based approach. Multi-hazard, hindi lang naman storm ang dumadating. Pag nagkaroon ng storm, ano ang kasunod? May flooding, may landslide, earthquake. Maaring magkaroon ng landslide, maaring magkaroon ng collapse ng structures, maaring magkaroon ng sunog. Multi-sectoral, meaning multi-sectoral. Hindi lamang DPWH yan, nagagawa lang ng kalye. Hindi lamang education. Hindi lamang pagkain yan. You think about health, education, infrastructure, communication, multi-sectoral. Interagency. An agency has to perform its specific role. Pag ginawa ng DPWH, yung wash, yung mga latrines, yung kalsada, kailangan DSWD o DILG, yung mga tanod, ang maglilinis ng kalye. Sila rin ang mag-take care ng mga latrines. And the most important thing, it's community-based approach. Kahit anong ganda ng mga structure and facilities, if you don't involve the people in managing it, wala yan. The whole community is involved. In fact, from the start, from selecting, from identifying the needs, it should be community approach. And that is where napakahalaga ng community organization. Let us continue with the RA 10121, no? Which is the Philippine DRRM Act of 2010. We have the DRRM framework. We look at risk factors. Ano yung risk factors? We have the hazard, the exposure, the vulnerabilities, and the capacities. Diyan tayo babalik, the basic. Ano ba yung, ano nga ulit? Ang hazard? Ano yung panganib? Ano yung exposure? Ano yung kahinaan? Ano yung kalakasan? Hazard, exposure, vulnerabilities, and capacities will determine our risk of sakuna. Sakuna is the disaster. So, tinitignan, ang ating end view is to have safer, adaptive, disaster-resilient Filipino communities towards sustainable development. So, meron tayo yan, yung cycle, no? The focus. We have mitigation, prevention, preparedness, recovery, and rehabilitation. So, patuloy yan, no? Bakit cyclical? Ang sabi natin, we have 365 days in a year. We have more than 20 typhoons a year. We have almost an earthquake every minute. Pero hindi naman natin nararamdaman lahat. Madalas tayong merong sunog. May bagyo o walang bagyo, malakas ang ulan, malakas ang buhos ng tubig, meron tayong floodings. So, kailangan we need to mainstream DRR, climate change in the planning and implementation of development in all levels of our government. Magmula sa barangay, sa municipality or city, province, region, and then national. As I mentioned, under this current administration, disaster prevention or preparedness is one of the priorities. Review natin kung sino ba ang ahensya. Sabi natin, it's an interagency, multi-sectoral approach, yung DRR natin. Okay, let's look at now the different agencies involved in our DRR. Under prevention and mitigation, the lead agency is the Department of Science and Technology, DOST. Sino yung nando doon? Pag-asa, PhilBox, ano pa? So, ano objective niyan? Is reduce the vulnerability of elements of risk. Paano? Tinitignan natin yung natural at man-made hazards. Binabantayan ng pag-asa ang mga bagyo. Kaya tayo may signal typhoon warning system. Tinitignan nasan ba yung mga tao. Sino yung mahihirap? Ano yung economic systems? Ano yung dynamics? Ano yung kanilang institutions na nandoon? Tinitignan yung exposure. Ano yung CLUP? Comprehensive Land Use Planning. So, tinitignan mo doon yung mababang lugar, tinitignan mo yung mga highly urban areas, at yung mga maraming tao. Importante ang zoning. Importante na alam ng tao ang mapa. So, those are all prevention and mitigation measures. Bago pa dumating ang panganib. Next, we have the DILG. Department of Interior and Local Governments. We reduce the loss so that it may result from future disasters. Local government, from the barangay, municipality, city, and province. Sila yung nag-oorganisa ng mga DRRM offices. Sila yung nagdi-develop ng mga plano. Sila yung nagbibigay ng mga trainings. Sila yung nagbibigay ng mga kagamitan. No? Communication system, water, life-saving devices, plano at drill. So, DILG yan. So, that is preparedness. No? Preparedness, paghahanda. So, yung unang dalawa, prevention and mitigation, will lessen your disaster or risk of a disaster. So, sabi natin kanina, yung response, mas nangunguna ang DSWD. Kasi yan yung immediate na pangangailangan. No? Ensuring the survival of the community, ng mga tao. So ano yan? Unang-una, pangailangan natin pagkain. Di ba? Tulugan. Para ma-stabilize ang communication. But mind you, under the response, one of the major needs of people now in all disaster is communication. We feel safer pag alam natin yung kamag-anak natin o yung tatay natin ay ligtas. That's why communication is very important. So yan yung response. And sabi ko nga kanina, doon sa isang module, it's a multi-sectoral and multi-need approach. Hindi lang sari-saring dilata. We have now mami, noodles, tinapay, bigas, hygiene kits, sabon, toothpaste, sanitary facilities, water. And after the response, we go into rehabilitation. It is led by the NEDA. So it's being better and build better. So yung tao bubuhayin ulit, nasadlak sa lupa, bumagsak, natabunan, kailangan mo silang ibangon. Getting back the population to normal life. So, and it depende sa disaster or sa hazard, maaring mangyari yan in 3 days, in 1 day, or in several months or even years. World War II, the rehabilitation happened in 10 years, or more than 10 years. Typhoon Haiyan, 2013, we are on the 6th year. Marawi, 2 taon na, 3 taon. So that is the disaster risk reduction framework here in the Philippines. Some other countries might have different, but they, reminder again, it's the 5 basic focus always. Mitigation, prevention, preparedness, response, and rehabilitation. That ends our module.